Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another episode of Friday Morning at the Funhouse, alongside, of course, the esteemed Mr. Martin Popoff. Good morning, my friend. How are you?
Morning, sir. Doing okay. Good to see Friday roll around again, and it's
Yeah.
it's F1 weekend, which is really cool. So and
Did you
our
guys
run
get
went
lots of
for a
snow
weekend.
this week?
Yeah, we're supposed to get some more, and we did get a lot earlier in the week, but yeah, it's winter still hanging around, but
Yeah, we got our first snowstorm of the season on, what was it, Tuesday into Wednesday, I guess. So we got about 6 or 7 inches of snow.
yeah,
And then yesterday was 55 degrees, so it all melted. And today we're getting more snow and ice
yeah,
and rain and
same thing
whatever. At
here.
this
Yeah,
point, I'm just like, just get us to spring already. I've had it with this
yeah,
crazy winter.
yeah.
It's like it just doesn't know what the hell it wants to do. Mother Nature is having lots of fun with us this year, I think. So whatever. So we've got a fun episode for you here today. This is a topic that comes up all the time, and I think it's especially relevant for this channel because a lot of the bands that we tend to talk about, especially like newer bands or even the older bands, there's this whole idea of retro sounds, retro look, retro style, retro albums, that sort of thing, whether it be newer bands that have come on the scene who are playing in a style that we love from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, or bands that go in, they try to use all the vintage style equipment and production values to get that retro sound, to make it sound like the 70s, because I think we all have this kind of like idea in our heads that the music, the sounds, the production values, the albums of the 70s are like the holy grails, right? Wouldn't it be great to recapture that sound of the 70s or even the early mid 80s? And then how about these bands that have been around for a long, long time and maybe got away from their original sound, and now in more recent years they're trying to go back and do their own version of retro on their own style from 40, 50 years ago, right? So there's this whole thing of retro. I mean, Martin, with this, like the last 20 years that I think we've really heard this the most, right? I mean, it's not something that just happened overnight. This has been building for a couple of decades now, I think.
Yeah. We'll go through a bit of a history of it, but yeah, you're right. So there's the categories. We talk back and forth, and loosely speaking, Pete, you're gonna be the pro of this whole thing, and I'm gonna be a little con, saying I'm getting less value maybe than you are out of this sort of thing. But there's bands who are celebrating a genre. There are bands that are celebrating specifically an older band, and then there's bands who are celebrating themselves from the 70s, sort of thing, right? So
Yeah.
there's a lot of ways to look at it, and yeah, it's the idea of when you go to listen to new music, should there be a more elevated and lofty category for listening to new music that doesn't have a retro element in it, and then below that is like, oh, I'm listening to new music but it's retro new music, and then below that I'm listening to old music, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's funny that way, but yeah, we're going to break down essentially the categories here.
Yeah, new music that sounds old, right? That kind of defeats the purpose of calling it new music to some people, which is
Yeah,
an interesting conversation.
yeah.
So, yeah, so why don't we? So we'll have Martin kickstarting us here on the
Okay.
whole thing of like retro mimicking genres, getting a style of music and kind of like making that your basis. So it's like, here's this style of music. It was popular in X decade or X years, and we're gonna go and we're gonna do that sound, as opposed to any like one band. It's more like a sound, a style, a
Yeah.
look, an image, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I've got a few props here. For me, it's kind of weird. It's almost like the one that sticks out to me when we were, Tim Henderson and myself were starting Brave Words and Bloody Knuckles magazine, 94 into 95 and stuff. The first one that really seemed to sort of hit was the idea of doom and stoner rock. I mean, this feels like the original version of this idea, right? So you've got Caius going mainly into this one is where I really felt that, right? And then a few other bands prop wise, we'll kind of stay in roughly chronological. Sorry, stay on mic here. Chronological order. Then you had the American version of it. With the vans and the skateboards and stuff. Then you had bands who would call themselves things like Mushroom River Band, which sounds like we're going to name ourselves after an indie sort of thing. You got Spiritual Beggars, of course, a bunch of that stuff. You've got more Mushroom River Band, and then you've got the corporate version of it, right? Monster Magnet on a
Yeah.
major label on A&M, where you're sounding like, you know, stoner fuzz psychedelic Hawkwind, heavy Hawkwind stuff. And then there's more Fu Manchu, you know, literally a guy in a skateboard. And then this came along, the power metal revival, right? So in terms of genres, it's funny. It's almost like in all of this, but here in particular, actually in our second category too, but it's almost like you're thinking, these bands are thinking like you as a fan, and saying to themselves, I want to make a record that I want to listen to, and there's not enough of this gosh darn great Sabbath related stuff out there, so I'm going to make it myself, sort of thing. So they're thinking like a fan. It's a little bit of a you know, an analogous to when Metallica covered the songs that you, as a total metalhead fan, say, yeah, that was a perfect choice, right? Because how many times, 75% of the times, bands cover songs that you go, well, you know, I don't care about Sunshine of My Love very much, but I guess you do. But Metallica's covering Diamond Head and obscure Golden Earring and Jethro Tull songs, and I Got the Fire and all this stuff. So it's kind of a little bit like that, but it's not a cover situation. It's them saying, you know, we want to make the same sort of music, and so you get excited about it to begin with, and it's a little bit of a joke. It's a little bit kind of like a comedy show, right? It's you're going, that's cool, I see what you're doing there, and it's pretty cool, and you got the big fuzzy, you know, guitars, and this is so out of vogue. It's, you know, you're wearing bell bottoms and all this stuff. So you love it to begin with, and again, the biggest one really that seemed to have the best stuff. I mean, I really find the whole stoner rock thing and doom thing was done much better, because there's a lot more European bands in it.
Yeah.
Then well, no, I guess there's you know, I'm thinking power metal, but there was a lot of European bands in power metal as well. And you've got, later you had the new wave of British heavy metal revival, but I just felt like the whole doom thing, you know, stoner rock felt a little more comedic than doom. Doom felt like it was done with more seriousness, sort of thing. And then of course you go on and you've got all the newer bands doing it, and they're adding a lot to the situation, and in you know, improving the production values, not just making it retro. But again, I don't know where I'm going with this sort of, it's almost like when there's too many of them, perhaps it gets to be overkill, and then you're not really into it anymore, and you're feeling like these bands are all of a pack. And when you're of a pack, you've got a little asterisk next to your name, right? It's like we really have a purpose here, and the purpose isn't pure creativity. It's pure creativity, you know, with the specific sort of thing in mind, where it's like we're trying to sound like an old band. So I don't know, what have you got to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting when you look at this, all right, so you named two, right? So you have the whole like kind of psychedelic stoner rock, stoner metal, and then you got the power metal thing. I would even throw, again, we're looking at the 90s here, right? For the most part. And then let's throw another one into the fray here, the whole big new wave of progressive rock that was happening in the 90s as well. We had like a lot of British and European bands, and then some American bands who were going, and they were saying, all right, we've had this big gap of no real prog to speak of. I mean, lastly, it was the early 80s explosion of bands like Marillion and IQ and whatnot, who were also doing a retro thing from the 70s. But again, there was a gap there. So you had prog coming back out, all these bands trying to ape this whole classic prog sound. You had the power metal bands, mostly European power metal bands, who were going back to the Halloween days and whatnot. And there was a kind of a gap there, because, you know, metal, everybody proclaimed that metal was dead by the end of the 80s, right? Going into the 90s, all of a sudden dance music and hip hop and country and pop, and then alternative and grunge and all that kind of stuff is the flavor of the month. And a lot of these genres kind of like under the radar a little bit. Classic metal under the radar quite a bit. So, you know, how many years had it been since heavy music like doom, what we now call doom, it would have been kind of dormant for a while. You know, sure, you had bands like Candlemass still kind of doing some stuff on the scene, but for the most part, it's pretty quiet. So all of a sudden in the 90s, you've got all these bands that want to kind of go back to that sound of Sabbath and Pentagram and St. Vitus and so on and so forth, but yet mixing it with that whole psychedelic thing and that whole biker rock mentality. So to me, it's like a lot of these retro bands and movements kind of, to me, it always seemed like they happened because of a lack of the classic bands doing these styles anymore. There was like a gap there. I think that like music really changed as we moved into the 90s. And I think these movements were a response to say, hey, we still love this kind of music. It seems like nobody gives a shit about it anymore, but we do, and we want to bring it back into the forefront. I mean, because the whole stoner thing just exploded. And Martin, even today, there's tons of bands doing that now, like more so that you can even keep track of. I'm amazed every day. I hear people mentioning all these bands that do this kind of like stoner thing, and it's crazy. I mean, they're keeping it all alive, and there's no shortage of it. It's just absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
How good it all is, that's, I guess, up to the consumer to decide. But I would say now more than ever, if you like these styles of music, there's so much out there for you to check out. I mean, it's none of it's popular. The masses don't know about any of this stuff, but there's plenty of good, fresh new music from bands who are kind of mimicking that style that maybe fell out of favor with the general public 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, some of the bands we talked about, like Green Lung, Witchcraft, Graveyard, Big Elf here. So Big Elf is like synthesizing a bunch of things, bringing back Mellotron and Hammond organ and
I
stuff
mean,
like
that says it all right there, right? That's the cover of
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
first Big
Yeah.
Elf out. So you got,
Yeah.
it's like they're proclaiming where we're not only going to sound retro, but we're going to use all the old equipment. So they've got, Mellotrons and Hammond organs and Moog synthesizers, Orange amps, Marshall amps, all, classic
Yeah.
equipment. And we're going to go for that sound of the 70s that we love and miss so much. So they went all out to make it sound as authentic as possible.
Yeah. And Wolf Mother is one that gets debated as they were pretty big doing this, bringing it back. But you brought up some interesting things, like the idea of there has to be a gap first, right? So and it also has to be so uncool that it could be cool again, right? I mean, it really has to, you have to get so far away from it. And like you say, there was Candlemass and Trouble, and I suppose it starts with Witchfinder General or whatever, but it's almost like when those bands were doing it, there wasn't a movement attached to it. As soon as there's a movement attached to it and you actually get record labels that identify with that certain sort of sound, that's another thing that feels like a little bit of it's getting too neat and tidy. I suppose that's it, right? It feels like with Witchfinder General or Candlemass or Trouble that you're alone doing this, and you have this burning desire to do this even when it's not cool. But then when there's too much of it, it becomes a little bit too much. And like you say, the doom thing, definitely, there's so much of that now. But I think the big difference is that they're really coming up with some incredible like arrangements and production techniques that they're applying to this stuff as well. And it does seem like the songwriting is evolving. So, but again, on the same token, I wonder, it's like, again, is listening to completely fresh new music where you almost can't figure out where it's coming from, is that a better thing? And then, if you love that old stuff, you can continue to explore other older bands of that genre that you missed before.
Well, that's another thing.
Well,
There's always plenty of that, right? There's always plenty of that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an interesting point because I think back to a comment that Karen LaPreziosa from the Hudson Valley Squares made a couple of weeks ago on one of the episodes. She said that, I mean, she loves, her sweet spot are the exact type of bands we're talking about, these kind of like doom, psychedelic, fuzz-laden bands, right, that are popping up on the scene left and right. But she made a comment. She said that when they get too close to Black Sabbath, she tends to push back. Which is interesting because that's the roots of all this stuff, right? But there are bands, and which we'll probably get into in a couple minutes, that have made their now new careers based on sounding like classic Black Sabbath from the early 70s. And for some people, they don't really like that because, well, we have the original. So if you're going to do something in that style, sound a little bit more original, but don't totally mimic Black Sabbath, because otherwise I could just go listen to Black Sabbath and that'll always be better, right? It'll always be better. There's no topping that.
Yeah. All right. So our next category was bands who are, are not just wanting to be part of a genre. They seem to be aiming at a specific band sort of thing, right? And that all started with, or I'm sure you could pick a lot through time, but this was a big one, right? Kingdom Come,
Yeah.
with the whole Led Zeppelin thing going, right? And other ones in that department that are a little bit more interesting and debatable are the likes of Jellyfish. One of the only bands that you could say took any sort of a run at classic Queen. And you've got bands like Airborne. So you've got, I've done a History in 5 Songs podcast episode. I think I've done one on the Led Zeppelin family, the Motorhead family, and the AC/DC family, right? So you have these families of bands that are aiming at a certain thing, and now the idea is almost like, well, I want to make an album that I would want to listen to, and not linked to a genre, but it's because AC/DC isn't making enough records and they aren't as good as I want them to be.
Right.
Or Led Zeppelin's long and gone. Where is the next Led Zeppelin? We need a new Led Zeppelin. Hence Bonham, Black Country Communion, Coverdale Page, the Black Crows are the new, Faces or British Blues Boom Band, slash Grateful Dead or whatever. Like, we need a new version of this because I want to listen to it. So that's your positive creative impulse, right?
Yeah.
You want to make something that you would want to listen to. I've heard that one in interviews lots of times, right? And it's kind of cool, right? And I've often thought that people have asked me, what kind of band would you be in if you wanted to do a band, if you really had the desire to go out and be a drummer in a band and probably a lyricist and have a bunch of ideas and even write songs or whatever. For some weird reason, I don't have a lot of desire to be in a band, but I've often thought, it'd probably sound like Clutch, probably sound like a stoner rock band, right? And then it's like, so why would I do that? Because obviously it's the same kind of thing. It's like, I like that old music. I'd want to make some new music that sounded like the old music. And it's not a good impulse, right? Really. So again, all of these bands, I just feel like, I almost feel like the root band is a distraction while you're listening to them. And for that reason, it's lesser, and it is a parody, as it's ripping on the old band, right? So there's always going to be something lesser about the thing, but there's a lot of little families of that where what, I don't know, how do you feel about these bands that sound like old bands?
So this, to me, this has always been a touchy subject with me. Because I think sometimes you have to take your mindset out of, okay, they sound like this classic band that I love. And for me, this is just me speaking, not anybody else. And you hit the nail on the head a couple minutes ago. When the classic band that you love that played in a specific style has not been around for 30 years, 40 years, they're not making any new music, or the new music they make sucks, and you really miss that classic old music that they made, that original music they made. What is the harm in having a newer band come out that kind of picks up the mantle and creates fresh original music that reminds you of that? Yeah. To me, I don't see the harm in that. And quite frankly, I love that. I don't have an issue with that. I will gravitate towards bands that are doing like a Sabbath thing, that are doing a Zeppelin thing, that are doing a Heat thing, a Deep Purple, or Rush, or whatever, because I know in most cases a good chunk of these bands are not around anymore and haven't been around. So my thought process is, do I want to go the rest of my life hearing new music that reminds me of that? Because the original band's not doing it anymore. So, and I can go and continue to listen to those old original albums for the rest of my life, but I've already heard them a million times. I know them, back of my hand. And wouldn't it be nice to have something new that I could get into that kind of reminds me of that? So I don't have an issue with that. But on the other token, and I kind of hinted at this before, there are people who are like, I don't want anybody else to sound like those bands that I love. And I would rather listen to those same 9 Led Zeppelin albums for the rest of my life, than hear a band playing like Led Zeppelin. Personally, that's not me. I don't really agree with that. I respect that decision and that opinion, but that's never been me, because I guess I have a thirst for listening to new albums, new bands all the time. And for me, if I was just to listen to the same Sabbath, Zeppelin, Heat, Purple, Whitesnake albums for the rest of my life and nothing else, I'd be bored by now because I've been listening to those for 40 plus years, right? And it's like I want something new. So in getting back to like the bands, right? So there's tons of these. I mean, like we mentioned the Sabbath, kind of the bands that do the Sabbath thing. I mean, Orchid from San Francisco. This is like listening to like a Long Lost Sabbath album. Well, there are a couple of records they broke up for a number of years, but I think they're back again. It's the singer sounds like Ozzy, the guitar riffs sound like Iommi. I mean, it's as close to Sabbath as you can possibly get. If you're a Thin Lizzy fan, you miss Thin Lizzy. Well, you had Gypsy Hawk. It's a gypsy. It's the Thin Lizzy formula to a T. Twin guitars, singer sounds like Phil. I mean, you mentioned Spiritual Beggars before. It's like Sabbath meets Deep Purple. If Heap is still around. We'll get to Heap in a couple of minutes, but there's Blind Gollum, who Ken Hensley. It's the last thing he recorded on. He even plays on the album. They sound like Uriah Heep circa 1972. You got Rival Sons, who are probably one of the leaders of this modern retro movement, who sound like an updated version of Bad Company. You got, we could do a whole show on Sweden, for crying out loud. I mean, they've got bands coming out of the woodwork in Sweden who sound like one or another 70s band. Sienna Root, I mean, it's got like Grand Funk Railroad and Free and all sorts of other stuff. If you love like vintage Whitesnake and Rainbow, you got Voodoo Circle, featuring some guys from Primal Fear. You mentioned the Queen thing before. How about Cats in Space from the UK?
Yep.
They're doing like Queen and ELO
Styx.
and Supertramp and Styx.
Yep.
I mean, it's just vibrant, fun, hook-laden music. But I've seen people, and most of the like comments I've seen about Cats in Space really love them. But then I see the odd comment here and there. It's like, it sounds too derivative of stuff I listened to back in the 70s and early 80s. Why should I listen to that when I can go listen to the originals? And I'm like, okay. Prague, all right. Wobbler. From Norway.
Yes,
it's like listening to a long lost Yes or Genesis album or King Crimson album from 1972. Stunning. And again, they go for all the vintage equipment and instruments, right? There's Mellotron all over the place on here, Hammond organ, Moog synthesizer, 12-string guitars, vocalist sounds like John Anderson, just crazy good stuff. Birth is another one, US band. Again, just goes right back to that early 70s sound. You got, I'm wearing the shirt today for a reason, but Blues Pills. Again, it's got a female singer, kind of like Janis Joplin.
Big Elf here, so
Big Elf, Big Elf. I mean, they're a perfect example. And I know Damon Fox, who I know he loves old like prog and psych and glam, and he incorporates all that stuff, heavy rock. So, I mean, there's tons of other bands. Graveyard is another one. You mentioned kind of the resurgence of like new wave of British heavy metal and classic metal. I mean, a band like Night Demon. You listen to a Night Demon album, it sounds like it came out in 81 or 82, but they're a new young band, right? Palace, again, Prague and hard rock, Cadaver from Germany. All these bands just love the 70s and 80s music. And, Lucifer is another one. And you listen to the albums and you think you're being transported back to like 1974, 1975, or 1981. To me, there's a charm in that. But there are people who will resist it. And I get it. But to me, if I can't hear some of my favorite bands from 40, 50 years ago who are no longer around play that style of music, I am very open-minded to a younger band saying, hey, we love that stuff too. So we're going to go do something similar. It'll have our own kind of stamp on it, but it's going to remind you of XYZ bands, right?
Yeah. But the funny thing about the younger bands is like you think, okay, you're not from that time. You weren't there at the time. So there's some version of authenticity missing, right? You're filtering this back to us, but you brought it in secondhand, literally just from the records, like all of us. But you weren't actually on the street at the time. Experiencing that economy, experiencing that equipment, as it was being, trotted out for the first time or whatever. And then the other funny thing is, you think about Sweden or whatever, it's like, it can be distracting to think, well, you're from Sweden and it's the new wave of British heavy metal, or you're from Sweden and it's American blues. So you know what you know you're giving us the version that comes off of Wikipedia in a way, kind of thing, right?
Yeah, but on the same token, if you go back to like the late 60s, early 70s, like those original like British blues and blues rock bands, I mean, they were just aping American blues artists,
Yeah.
like, I mean, so really, I think
Yeah.
musicians have been doing that forever.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
kind of strange, but I want to go back to your point about the younger bands having not lived through those originals. I mean, Greta Van Fleet is a perfect example. So they get a lot of shit nowadays because they go out and they sound, I mean, come on, let's be real. They sound so much like Led Zeppelin, it's ridiculous. And then they'll make a statement saying, yeah, we're not really influenced by Zeppelin. We never really listened to Zeppelin. And you're like, how is that possible? I mean, you listen to all the guitar work, you listen to the vocals. I mean, that's, if they're not trying to, it's the biggest coincidence I've ever seen in my entire life, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, and they got extra heck for that because of putting down the resemblance to Led Zeppelin sort of thing. But again, it's very much a novelty sort of act, and it's hard to get the distraction out of your mind of that act. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting when there's a family, and then sometimes the family is sometimes the family is at the same time, which is kind of interesting, where a band becomes big and then you've got the band similar to it kind of at the same time. So you've got AC/DC with Heaven and Angel City, or the Angels at the same time, and Crocus at the same time.
Yeah.
You get it. Yeah, I remember when I did the Motorhead family thing, it was kind of interesting that, this Motorhead sound, quickly you had, Avenger and Tyson Dog and Tank and Warfare and Girl School to some extent, creating a family kind of around a sound that was a Motorhead sound and not really a genre. You could call it, I've called it, dirty new wave of British heavy metal or whatever, biker, the biker version. So yeah, you could be a mimic of a band just because they're super hot at the time.
Well, you remember when Voivod first hit the scene? I mean, I thought they sounded just like Venom, and Venom were, just starting to hit their stride. It's like, well, that's kind of soon to be having, because I mean, now we're going back 40 years, and this kind of whole concept was kind of new at the time. Because in the 70s, you didn't really have this all that much. Where they talked about this, but now it's like, now you hear it all the time.
Well, and I think some of it is just sheer numbers, how the number of bands and how easy it is to be a band and make a record just goes up and up and up for various reasons over time. The first reason it happened was because there started to be more of an indie label scene and a do-it-yourself scene with punk and then new wave of British heavy metal, and then all those little labels. Well, even when we talk about the stoner rock evolution with Third Stone and who else? Who was Chevy on? I forget all the ones. Frank Cossack's label. There were a bunch of stoner rock labels all at the same time. And then now it's technology and how easy it is to make a record on your laptop, as they say, right? So, so now you're going to get way more bands that are sounding like other bands. But okay, so our last category is again this idea of is it a little bit lesser as for you as a listener and lesser for the band themselves when they kind of like give up on doing these daring things throughout and recline back into their old sound. And a few like that is I feel a little bit that way with Uriah Heep. I love Uriah Heep, but I made a comment on Facebook saying, I've listened to the new Uriah Heep. I love it. It might, and I've said this about Megadeth too. It's a bizarre thing to say, but it's like I've said, this is the best Megadeth album ever. This is the best Uriah Heep album ever. Do I need to listen to it too many more times? No. Because they've given us 4 or 5 or 6 that are as good, right? Except we've talked about this as well, right? You think of Kiss is hotly debated with these last 2 albums, right? I think they're perfectly fine. I like them a lot. I like Heart, what they're doing now. People will always crab perennially about Metallica, right? It's the same sort of thing. So it's like, are we happy when these bands go back and do this? Some of us are, or do we want them to keep pushing forward, sort of thing, or do they have this amazing sound that they shouldn't have abandoned along the way to do these experiments. So again, it's like as a music fan, is it lesser to just be listening to the same old bands that you've always listened to? B, is it lesser when you're listening to those same old bands and they're being the same old band from the 80s or the 70s sort of thing? So are there two asterisks and marks against you know uh, the idea that you're listening to new music and you're listening to fresh music? Because as we go along, like there are fresh genres, there are fresh bands doing a completely new experimental kind of music. There's genres way outside of your regular genre. So yeah, is there a little bit of is there too much comfort with Metallica's sound as it exists now?
Yeah, I mean it's like a double-edged sword, and you and I both talked to plenty of musicians who get very frustrated with this. It's like if they go and they make new music that sounds completely different, the hardcore fan rejects it.
Mm-hmm.
But if they go and they make new music that sounds just like the old music, some of the hardcore fans reject it because they're not moving forward. They're just rehashing and making the same album over and over again. I mean, it's like the critics of AC/DC and Motorhead, right? So they made the same albums over and over and over again. But if either one of those bands were to have released an album that was completely left field different, that would get rejected too. So it's like you're in like a catch-22 situation. You really can't win. I mean, Metallica is a interesting example because, and we've talked about this before, it's like they went many, many years with saying, we're tired of metal. We want to do other things. We want to explore, hard rock and this, that, and the other thing. And the masses kind of reject that a little bit. You have the new fans that have come on board with Metallica since like the Load days. But the folks, the fans who were following Metallica from the very early days, generally shit on those albums. So now when they've come back and they've made a couple of albums in a row that kind of go back to their early sound, some of us still complain that it sounds forced because we know they've come out and said they don't really like that old stuff anymore. So were they just doing this just to make a little extra cash and to shut the critics up? I don't know. Does it feel forced? Is it something they really want to do? Because for me, I want the bands to do that sort of retro sound, their own retro sound, because they want to, not just because they think it's something they should be done. You brought up Uriah Heep before. There's a perfect example of a band that just really has never shied away, other than a little couple years in the 80s. They've never shied away from doing what they do best. And for longtime fans, I mean, I'll agree with you. I think the last handful of records that Uriah Heep has put out is some of the best stuff compared to, stacks up really well against the really early albums, the first like 5 or 6 albums. Are they better than them? Probably not. But better than anything else they've released since High and Mighty, maybe with the exception of Abominage, I would say yes, without hesitation. So I don't mind when bands go back to their core sound after many, many years, as long as the music's memorable and it's good, right? And it clicks off a couple of the boxes. I mean,
there's an interesting case. I almost think that what Deep Purple's done with Bob Ezrin picks up on some of the best. So some of the best new stuff. I think of like Cadaver, The Vintage Caravan, Early Moods, Graveyard, Witchcraft, Horizont, Green Lung, definitely. The idea of finding new ways to do the old sound. And I think Deep Purple somehow have found like this odd little alchemical chemistry that they've got going with Bob Ezrin, where it sounds kind of sophisticatedly, subtly different than the old stuff. Like it's not a completely retro production situation. And some of these bands are like that, where you're hearing new production things applied, like new guitar tones, like weird Oz fuzziness in the guitars that you've never heard before, or weird clattery or electronicness, but subtly put in there. Maybe some triggering going on, some sampling going on, but it's done really tastefully that you go, wow, that's kind of different and kind of new. So along the way with this retro thing, it's almost like Deep Purple and some of these other bands have found this way to weasel in and do something super interesting, but they're like 5 little hard to see, super interesting little things.
It's subtle,
that
right?
You get here, right? And Heap, I think, and Accept and Saxon those subtleties aren't there. They're doing amazing stuff and writing really good songs but they've essentially gone for a sober approach, a conservative approach to the production and to the songwriting situation. But yeah, it's almost like Deep Purple might be the best example of this idea of 5 or 6 weird little modern things applied in there, like the best of the pure retro bands.
Yeah, Deep Purple is an interesting example here because I think they're working with a producer now that they never worked with before, who has a history of doing very cool productions and bringing different things to different bands. I mean, look at Kiss and Alice Cooper, right? What he did with them, but also you're taking one little element. It's not a little element, a big element out of the band. That's Blackmore. So you're pulling Blackmore out. And over the last bunch of years, he's no longer in the band now, but you drop Steve Morse in there, and then you take out John Lord and you drop in Don Airey, right? So you got some subtle differences there. But yeah. I would argue that all these recent Deep Purple albums, they still sound like Deep Purple, right? They're just missing a couple little things there. But I think Bob Ezrin has helped them put some interesting flavors back into their music. So it still sounds like a Deep Purple record, but it doesn't sound like In Rock. It doesn't sound like Machine Head. It doesn't sound like Perfect Strangers. It still sounds like Purple. Yeah. But there's some subtle differences that I think make it work. And I think that also brings up another kind of avenue to go down here, is when you have these classic bands that want to do retro sounding version of their original sound, but they've got significantly different members in the band now, right? So Styx is another example. So the last 2 Styx album, Crash to the Crown and The Mission, right? They've gone back and let's make albums like Styx made in the late 70s. But we no longer have, Dennis DeYoung in the band. We have now this other lineup that's been together for quite a long time. So there's subtle differences, but it still sounds like a classic Styx album. Cheap Trick. I mean, this sounds like this takes me right back to the late 70s, early 80s for Cheap Trick, right? This is total retro Cheap Trick stuff. But as we proved on a lot of in our Ranking the Albums episode of Cheap Trick, I mean, they've been doing that for a while now. I mean, a lot of their last bunch of albums have that classic Cheap Trick sound. What else? Kansas is another perfect example. So Kansas has a drastically different lineup in more recent years. Steve Walsh retired from the band. Robbie Steinhardt passed away. Kerry Livgren retired from performing music. So you have this new version of Kansas that's been together now for a while, but they've gone back to making new music, new records that sound like vintage Kansas. But again, there's people out there, but because those original guys are no longer in the band, even though the music will take you back to the 70s, they kind of push back on it because, I mean, that's a whole other conversation, I think, when these classic bands try to go retro, but their lineups are significantly different and people reject it because it's not the original lineup, even if maybe physically that is impossible to have the original lineup based on people have died or, moved on to whatever it might be. Yeah. So that's a whole other conversation right there.
This brings up and another whole other conversation that I get into all the time with people, and it's a weird concept, but I truly believe this. It's like like when I said this is the best Uriah Heep album they ever made, right? And how much do I need to listen to it? Okay, that's a whole different thing, and that's why we're having this discussion, because yeah, I do feel overkill, and the fact that it's recent Heep, there's something weird about it being now versus then, but along these lines, I actually do truly believe, like, Motorhead's the best example that I usually bring this up with. You could take, any 3 medium grade songs off of Motorhead Motorizer or Hammered or Snakebite Love or whatever, like not even the top 1 or 2 songs, but say the 3rd, 4th, or 5th or 6th best song, right? And you could lift that song and drop it onto Ace of Spades or drop it onto Overkill, and hands down, for any Motorhead fan of any vintage or a casual fan or whatever, you'd say that's the best song on the album, right? And yet you've totally forgotten these songs even exist, right? These newer songs, right? But the fact of the matter is, it's this weird debate between is Motorizer the best Motorhead album of all time, or is it one of the old ones, right? And it's this thing. I've had very few rock stars push back on this, but Lemmy was one of the great ones where I'll never forget that quote. It's just like a toss away thing. It's like, oh, this is the best album we've ever done, or whatever, right? And then, but then he says, I just compared to the old stuff, he goes, the old stuff's it's a bit ropey, isn't it? Ropey. That's what he said. He goes, it's a bit ropey, isn't it? And he's right? Like you compare it, there's just not as much going on at the end of a bar with a fill, or whatever. Like you think of Mickey D, like, and the things, it's almost like they write songs just to end the bar with. And they'll do these cool little fills. None of that is on the old stuff. Of course, the production is crushing and amazing now versus what they had before, which had a certain vintage to it or whatever. But and the riffs are far less imaginative then as they are now. It's way less heavier when you start comparing them and you think about heaviness, right? But we're thinking, fact of the matter is, Overkill and Bomber are two of the very heaviest albums ever made in the 70s by anybody, right?
Yeah.
And now you're not going to say that about a new Motorhead album, but a new Motorhead album actually happens to be heavier than those albums, right? So yeah, it's this weird thing about when you're saying what is the best album by a band ever, there are a lot of arguments to be made for the latest few Heap albums or the latest few Heart albums, or like I say, certainly Motorhead, just saying it's actually better. And I said this about the last Megadeth too. But it's all wrapped up in, I think you got to treat it like sports statistics and say what broke the record at the time. I mean, when you break a record, you break a record. The record gets broken, it gets broken again, it gets broken 10 years later, right? So the importance that we attach to these records when we say they're the best of the catalog, and if we're picking something old, it's because of where it sat at the time and how important and how cool it was compared to its own competition, right?
Well, I mean, how important is that? Oh, man, this is gonna take a whole different turn here, but I think we, and I don't just mean you and I mean everybody watching, I think we have convinced ourselves over the years that the best albums from all these bands we're talking about were released in the 70s and the 80s. And how much of it is due to the fact that, is it the best? I mean, there is, who can quantify that? Is it the best? But how much of it has to do with our listening habits and where we were at the time? Because, and I harp on this a lot, and I truly believe it, because most of the time I've convinced myself too that the best albums from most of these classic bands were their first handful of albums, right? Whether it was the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, whenever they released them. And we always come up with this statement that, like, and as the longer bands stay together, they're less hungry to put out good music, and the music is never as good as the early albums. But how much of it has to do with the fact that when we were listening to these early albums by these classic bands, we were in a different place in our lives where what else did we have to do but get to know and love these records inside and out, listen to them over and over and over again. And right around the time where we are of the opinion that the music suffered was a time in our lives where we started having jobs and careers and going to college and having families and spending less time with these albums. Because I say this all the time. I get comments from people that are like, I'll review, a brand new album by a classic band or a new band, and I'll be like, oh, this is great. And I'll see a comment from someone saying, yeah, I listened to it once, I didn't grab it, I moved on, I don't need to listen to it again. And I'm thinking, well, when you were 14 or 15 or 16 years old and you bought that new album by that band, did you only listen to it once and toss it aside? No, you spent weeks and months with it. And, maybe, granted, at the time, you only bought 5 albums a year. So you had nothing better to do with your life than to spend hours and hours with those 5 albums. Today, and I'll be the first to admit it, it's hard when I'm getting 10 new albums in a week to digest and listen to and albums to rank. It's like, you feel like there's not enough hours in the day to spend with anything. So I get the mentality of listen to it once. If it doesn't immediately grab you, move on to something else. But then there's this whole thought process that, well, nothing these bands are releasing anymore is any good. And I question that because, like, well, if you had these same albums back when you were in your teens, would you be saying the same thing? Yeah. Or would you give them the time they deserve? Yeah. Right. and to decide whether it's really as good as the, because your Motorhead comment is spot on, Martin. I mean, you go back, I was listening, I was talking about the 1993 album the other day, and I went back and re-listened to it. I'm like, this is great. It's like, but it's one of those albums that I kind of ignored, right? I have it, I've listened to it, but I would have never said that any of those 90s albums would hold a candle to Bomber and Overkill and Another Perfect Day and Ace of Spades. Why? Because I know those albums so well, because that's what I did in the 80s. I spent all this time with them. And the ones in the 90s and the 2000s, I listened to, I like, but I had to move on to other things. Again, that's a lot because of my role in what I do, being a journalist and reviewing stuff and all that kind of, you have to kind of just keep moving on to other things. So how much time can you really spend with anything? So yeah, there's maybe 30 years from now, Martin, we can go back and really compare a lot of these albums from these classic bands who released plenty of albums over a span of decades, and are the later ones as good as the early ones? Are we ever going to admit that they are? Are we ever going to understand that they might be? I don't know. But I think there's a lot of factors here that most people don't take into consideration. They just cast off, we're living in a disposable world right now. So everything is a commodity. Everything, it's like, if it doesn't grab you in the first second, it's no good. Move on to the next. Yeah. And I wonder with music if people have lost the ability or the desire to let music kind of seep into their soul like we did when we were kids, when we were younger. Maybe our lifestyles just don't allow for that anymore. But I think to automatically state that the music is no good anymore, I think is doing the artist and then their creations a disservice, I think, personally.
Yeah. And I guess, it's another way of saying that you're into new music by championing the new music of the old band. So that's another way of saying you're into new music. But yeah, these retro bands, I guess, qualify as new music as well. And even the bands that are kind of like mimicking other bands, like you say, if the other bands aren't around, there's reason to say it's a valid thing to do too. So yeah. There's lots of new music and old music still around to explore. But yeah, I think about how there's way less rock t-shirts when you walk around a big city, right? I remember a trip to New York, and I was really like distinctly, this was like 10 years ago, but I remember, man, I have walked past today probably 100,000 people, and I think I've seen 2 rock t-shirts. It's like, wow, that's pretty interesting,
And the rock t-shirts, were they worn by people who don't listen to rock? Because that's the other thing. It's like, oh, that's a cool shirt. I don't know who the hell it is, but I'll buy it.
Yeah. Oh, I saw a funny YouTube video about that where a guy walked up and said, "Can you name 2 AC/DC songs? Can you name 2 Led Zeppelin songs?" And obviously, there's no way it would have. This had to be edited together to put only the best, but nobody could name anything, right? It was like, wow. But no, yeah, it's music is competing with so many different entertainment things, be it the internet or even just video games, right? So, and like we said, there's too much of it out there. But yeah, I don't know, this whole retro rock thing. It's always there's a little bit of a glass ceiling on every example of this in a way that I find kind of problematic. But
well, it begs the question, and I see this all the time. It's like, I think the people who are against the retro movements, whether it be from existing bands doing their own sound or newer bands coming up who are playing like an old band, people like, I don't want to hear something that sounds old. When are the new bands going to come out where they're going to play something completely original? And in 2023, is that even possible anymore? Is there anything that has not been done?
Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, when was the last time you can remember a like genre of music that came out that was popular, that people gravitated towards, that was really, really fresh and original? And I'm not just talking about rock music. I guess I'm talking about anything in general, because even the stuff that's popular today, there's nothing original there. So I don't know. Grunge really wasn't all that original, because that was borrowing stuff from the 70s and the 80s, right? Whether it be punk or whatever, classic rock and things like that. Are the 70s and maybe parts of the 80s, was that the last decade where we were going to see truly, truly original, groundbreaking, fresh music, new genres and new styles of music? I don't know.
maybe you hear it in pieces, right? You hear new ways of singing, you hear new instrument sounds, right? You hear new production techniques. You might hear a completely new instrument. So I think that happens a little bit because you think along in metal, you got black metal vocals. Corn was a weird, new, interesting thing,
Yeah,
right?
it was. Yeah.
The Pantera drum sound, and you think of
Yeah.
stuff like that, right? Even thrash itself when it happens. So it happens, but it happens as at a smaller and smaller and smaller subgenre level because it seems like everything under the sun has been done. But we always get surprised anyways. Something new seems to happen, but it might be just in one department, right? It might be just in singing or something, right?
Yeah. I think some people, they're only willing to give stuff a chance that's been deemed as, because there's this other mentality too that's like, well, it's not popular for a reason, or it hasn't sold, so it can't be good. And I think that's also kind of short-sighted to think that the only good music that's being created is stuff that sells, 500,000 copies, and now there's no copies anymore. It's like, it's only good if it's got X amount of, X million streams on YouTube or whatever, or plays on Spotify. That really doesn't matter much anymore. So there are people who are they're waiting to be told that, oh, this is really good, it's got X amount of streams on YouTube, so you should check it out. Well, what about maybe the great new album or bands that have 200 streams on YouTube that nobody's heard, but the music is really, really good? I think nowadays we have to do a little bit of investigative work to find some of this stuff. And if you're not willing to do that, you're not going to hear anything. So of course you're going to assume that music sucks, right?
That's a whole nother debate. And I think we kind of had that one in the do our opinions matter thing, right?
Yeah.
The gatekeepers, the journalists and all that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I don't know, Martin. Anyway, that is our discussion on all things retro. So I would be very curious to see what our viewers have to say about this, because I've seen both ends of the spectrum in comments over the years, and I know some people feel very, very strongly for and against it. And there's no right or wrong answer, right? But everybody knows how I feel. I think I've said my piece here in this episode. I think if you're putting up the blockers all the time, I get it. I wish you'd reconsider, but that's not up to me, right? That's so I don't know. Martin, any final words on the whole retro thing?
No, I think I'm done. I think I've definitely said my piece. I guess just as a blanket statement, I'm still more or less in the con department, but I think I've rediscovered through this discussion that whole thing about championing the very best of the old bands making better music now than the old days, because I swear I listen to only new Motorhead and I listen to only new Overkill, right? So sometimes I think that's the bright light in this. Like you can actually be a better version of your old self, and the whole Deep Purple thing. So I'll leave you with that thought.
Yeah. No, it's and you mentioned a couple bands who are just doing it, so that's But you got to be willing to give it a chance, right? And you have to take yourself out of that mindset that, like, well, it'll never be good as that stuff. Well, why not? If you give the new music by these classic bands the same amount of time and attention, you might change your opinion on it a little bit. So that's what it comes down to. But if you're not willing to do that, well, what are you going to do? So anyway, Martin, should we give them a little sneak peek of next week?
Yeah. What were we talking about for next week? I forget now. You start.
That's a Hall of Fame place.
Oh, right. Yes. Right. We were gonna talk about Frank, couch it in the. We'll talk specifically about the bands who have been nominated to go into the hall. But again, we'll make it a little bit of a rant, about the pros and cons of why you should care or not care about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That's a hotly debated thing every time this comes up, but it's topical because we'll go through the actual bands as well.
Yeah. So that's coming up next week. So stay tuned for that. And Martin, you got some exciting book news to talk about, don't you?
Yes. Just in is this one, AC/DC at 50. So I've got my copies of this. So the nice new Quarto hardcover with there we go. So yeah, full color throughout, the usual thing. Beautiful designs by this company. So I've got them in. It is at my site, so there are PayPal buttons for it all. So yeah, AC/DC at 50. It's like my Bowie at 75. Only this is 50 AC/DC career highlights instead of 75.
Very cool. So go to martinpopoff.com to check that out. Gorgeous looking book. I love the photograph of Angus on the front.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Looks really cool.
Yeah.
All right. So what do we got coming up here on the channel? We've got ranking the albums of Hot Tuna on Sunday. So stay tuned for that. And then, of course, we've got coming up next week, we've got the UK UK Connection on Saturday, but in the proxy on Tuesday, where we'll be doing an album study on Procol Harum's album Home, their 4th album. So that's coming up next week, as well as new album reviews and all sorts of other stuff. And then Martin and I will be back on Friday, of course, and another Ranking the Album episode a week from Sunday. So thanks for watching, everybody. Visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on YouTube, all together, all the damn time. Let's see those comments about all things retro down below. And till next time, I am Pete Pardo for Martin Popoff. Have a good one, everybody. Take care.